Have you ever wondered what it would be like to survive a winter so brutal that it could literally freeze your breath before it left your mouth? Well, imagine being a Viking in medieval Scandinavia, where winter wasn't just cold, it was a 6-month death sentence that most people today couldn't survive for even a single week. Most people think they understand how harsh Viking winters were. They picture some snow, maybe temperatures dropping below freezing, and Vikings huddled around fires telling stories. But the reality was so much more terrifying than anything Hollywood has ever shown you. These weren't just cold winters. They were apocalyptic frozen wastelands that transformed the entire landscape into a death trap, where a single mistake could mean you'd never see spring again. In this video, I'm going to reveal the 7 most horrifying aspects of Viking winters that historians rarely talk about. We're going to explore how these legendary warriors survived temperatures that would kill modern humans in hours, why their food storage methods were literally a matter of life and death, and the shocking psychological toll that months of darkness took on entire communities. But first, let me give you some context that will completely change how you think about winter survival. My name is here to take you on a journey back to a time when winter meant something completely different than it does today. I've spent years researching medieval climate data, archaeological evidence, and historical accounts to uncover the truth about what Viking winters were really like. What I discovered was so much worse than I ever imagined, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why these people were forced to become some of the most resourceful and ruthless survivors in human history. But before we dive into the nightmare that was a Viking winter, I need to set the stage with something that will blow your mind. The period we're talking about, roughly from 800 to 1200 CE, occurred during what climate scientists call the medieval warm period. That's right. These were actually some of the warmest centuries in recent history. So if you think Viking winters were brutal during the warm period, just wait until you hear what happened when the climate started cooling down. Now, most people assume that because Vikings were tough warriors, they must have been naturally adapted to cold weather. But here's the thing that changes everything. Vikings weren't superhuman. They were regular people, just like you and me, facing environmental conditions that would challenge even our most advanced modern survival technology. The difference was that they had no choice but to adapt or die, and the methods they developed were often more desperate than heroic. Let me paint you a picture of what a typical Viking settlement looked like as winter approached. Imagine a small cluster of wooden longhouses, maybe housing 50 to 100 people total, sitting on the edge of a fjord or nestled in a valley. These weren't the massive stone fortresses you see in movies. They were essentially large wooden sheds with dirt floors, minimal insulation, and roofs that leaked. Now, imagine that in just a few weeks, this entire area would be buried under several feet of snow, with temperatures dropping to levels that would make your modern winter thermostat weep. The first thing you need to understand about Viking winters is that they lasted far longer than anything we experience today. We're not talking about a few cold months from December to February. Viking winter could stretch from October all the way through April, with the worst conditions lasting for 4 solid months, where the sun might not rise above the horizon for weeks at a time. In the northernmost Viking settlements, they experienced what's called polar night, where the sun doesn't rise at all for months. But the length of winter was just the beginning of their problems. The temperatures were beyond anything most modern people can comprehend. While we complain when it drops below 0 Fahrenheit, Viking winters regularly saw temperatures plummet to -30, -40, or even -50 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, exposed skin freezes in minutes, metal becomes brittle enough to shatter, and even breathing becomes painful as the moisture in your lungs begins to freeze. Now, you might be thinking, surely they just stayed inside their warm houses until spring came, right? Well, here's where it gets really interesting. Viking longhouses weren't warm. They were death traps that required constant maintenance just to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning. The central fire pit that provided heat also filled the house with smoke, since proper chimneys weren't invented yet. Vikings had to choose between freezing to death or slowly suffocating on toxic fumes. The smoke problem was so severe that Viking houses had holes in the roof to let the smoke escape. But this also let in snow, rain, and freezing air. Imagine trying to sleep in a house where smoke is burning your eyes and lungs, snow is falling through the roof onto your bed, and the temperature inside is barely above freezing, even with a fire burning constantly. This was their reality for months at a time. But the real nightmare wasn't just the cold or the smoke. It was the complete isolation that winter brought. Once the snow started falling and the fjords began to freeze, Viking communities became completely cut off from the outside world. There were no roads to plough, no supply chains to maintain, and no way to get help if something went wrong. Each settlement was entirely on its own, with whatever food, fuel, and supplies they had managed to stockpile before winter arrived. This isolation created a pressure cooker effect that most people don't think about. Imagine being trapped in a small, smoky, freezing building with the same 50 people for 6 months straight. There's no privacy, no escape, and no way to leave even if tensions rise. Arguments that might normally blow over in a day could escalate into deadly feuds when people are trapped together for months. The psychological stress was so intense that many Viking sagas describe winter as a time when madness and violence were common. The food situation was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of all. Vikings didn't have refrigeration, canning, or any of the food preservation methods we take for granted today. They had to rely on smoking, salting, and drying to preserve enough food to last through the winter. But here's the catch: these preservation methods weren't foolproof. If the weather was too humid, meat would rot before it could be properly dried. If it was too dry, the food would become inedible. If raiders attacked and destroyed their food stores, or if they miscalculated how much food they needed, entire communities could face starvation. The archaeological evidence shows us that many Viking settlements experienced what historians call the hunger gap, a period in late winter or early spring when the previous year's food stores were running dangerously low, but new food sources weren't available yet. During these times, Vikings were forced to eat things that we would consider inedible today: tree bark, leather, and even the bones of animals they had already consumed. But even if they had enough food, the winter diet was monotonous and nutritionally deficient. For months, Vikings survived primarily on salted fish, dried meat, and whatever grains they could store. Fresh vegetables were impossible to preserve, so scurvy and other vitamin deficiency diseases were common. The lack of fresh food meant that their immune systems were weakened just when they needed them most, making them vulnerable to diseases that could spread rapidly through their crowded, poorly ventilated longhouses. The water situation was equally challenging. Rivers and wells would freeze solid, making it impossible to access fresh water for months at a time. Vikings had to melt snow and ice for all their water needs, which required precious fuel that they also needed for heat and cooking. This created a constant trade-off between staying warm and staying hydrated. Some settlements were forced to ration water, drinking barely enough to survive in order to conserve fuel for heating. Now, let's talk about clothing and how inadequate it really was. We often picture Vikings wearing thick fur coats and warm boots, but the reality was far different. Most Vikings were farmers or craftsmen, not wealthy warriors, and they couldn't afford elaborate winter gear. The average Viking wore layers of wool clothing, which provided some insulation when dry but became dangerously cold when wet. And in the humid, smoky environment of a longhouse, everything was constantly damp. Their footwear was particularly problematic. Viking boots were made of leather, which provided little insulation and became stiff and uncomfortable in extreme cold. Frostbite was common, and many Vikings suffered permanent damage to their feet and hands from repeated exposure to freezing temperatures. The archaeological record shows us skeletons with clear signs of frostbite damage, indicating that this was a widespread problem. The psychological toll of these conditions cannot be overstated. Modern research on seasonal affective disorder shows us how devastating prolonged darkness can be for human mental health. Now, imagine experiencing this in a time before electric lights, when the only illumination came from flickering fires and oil lamps. The combination of darkness, cold, hunger, and isolation created a perfect storm for depression and anxiety. Viking sagas and historical accounts describe winter as a time when supernatural beliefs became more intense. People reported seeing ghosts, spirits, and other supernatural phenomena during the darkest months. While we might dismiss these as folklore, they likely reflect the very real psychological stress that Vikings experienced during winter. Hallucinations, paranoia, and other mental health symptoms would have been common in communities suffering from malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, and extreme stress. The social structure of Viking communities also changed dramatically during winter. The normal activities of farming, trading, and raiding were impossible, so communities had to find new ways to occupy their time and maintain social order. Storytelling became crucial not just for entertainment, but for preserving important cultural knowledge and maintaining group cohesion. The long winter nights were when the great Viking sagas were told and retold, passing down everything from navigation techniques to legal traditions. But these storytelling sessions weren't just pleasant gatherings around a fire. They were often the only thing standing between a community and complete social breakdown. In the cramped, stressful conditions of a winter longhouse, entertainment and social rituals became matters of survival, communities that couldn't maintain morale and social order. During the winter months, often didn't survive to see spring. The health challenges went far beyond what we've already discussed. The combination of poor nutrition, crowded living conditions, and compromised immune systems made Viking communities vulnerable to epidemic diseases during winter. A single sick person could infect an entire settlement. And with no medical knowledge or antibiotics, diseases that we consider minor today could wipe out whole families. Childbirth during winter was particularly dangerous. Women who gave birth in the coldest months faced enormous risks, not just from the birth itself, but from the challenge of keeping a newborn alive in such harsh conditions. Infant mortality rates were already high in Viking times, but winter births had an even lower survival rate. The decision of when to have children was literally a matter of life and death, with most families trying to time births for the warmer months. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Viking winters was their unpredictability. While Vikings could prepare for a typical winter, they had no way to predict when an unusually harsh winter would arrive. Climate records show that the medieval period experienced significant weather variability, with some winters being far more severe than others. A winter that was just 20% colder or longer than usual could mean the difference between survival and death for an entire community. The archaeological evidence shows us settlements that were simply abandoned during particularly harsh winters, their inhabitants either dying or fleeing to other locations. These ghost towns, buried under centuries of soil and vegetation, tell the story of communities that couldn't survive when winter exceeded their ability to cope. The evidence of these failed settlements reveals something that modern survival experts are only beginning to understand. The margin for error in Viking winter survival was essentially zero. One broken storage container, one house fire, one key person falling ill at the wrong time, and an entire community could spiral into a death trap from which there was no escape. This brings us to one of the most overlooked aspects of Viking winter survival: the absolute dependence on community cooperation. In our modern world, we're used to individual solutions to problems. Your heating breaks down, you call a repair service. You run out of food, you go to the store. But for Vikings, survival was entirely communal. Every person in the settlement had to contribute perfectly to the collective survival effort, or everyone died together. This created a social pressure that's almost impossible for us to comprehend today. Imagine knowing that if you made a mistake, got sick, or couldn't pull your weight, you weren't just risking your own life, you were potentially dooming 50 other people, including children and elderly relatives. The psychological weight of this responsibility drove many Vikings to extreme measures that we would consider barbaric today. Historical accounts describe instances where communities made the horrifying decision to abandon their weakest members when resources became critically low. Elderly people who couldn't contribute to winter survival were sometimes left outside to freeze, not out of cruelty, but because keeping them alive meant everyone else would starve. These weren't decisions made by monsters, but by desperate people facing impossible choices that no human being should ever have to make. The concept of individual rights or personal space simply didn't exist during Viking winters. Privacy was a luxury that could get you killed. Every resource, every decision, every action had to be coordinated with the survival of the group in mind. People slept in communal beds not for warmth and companionship, but because individual sleeping arrangements would have wasted precious heat and space. Personal belongings were shared freely, because hoarding supplies could doom the entire community. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. The social hierarchy that existed during the warmer months often completely broke down during winter. The chieftain, who commanded respect during raiding season, might find his authority challenged by whoever was best at managing winter survival. Women often gained power during winter because they typically managed food storage and distribution, making them literally the gatekeepers between life and death. Children were valued not for their potential, but for their immediate ability to contribute to survival tasks. This social upheaval created internal conflicts that were just as dangerous as the external threats of cold and starvation. Viking sagas are full of stories about winter feuds that erupted when normal social structures collapsed under survival pressure. These weren't just arguments. They were life or death struggles for resources and control that could tear apart communities that had lived together peacefully for generations. The sleep patterns of Vikings during winter were completely different from anything we experience today. With only a few hours of dim daylight, Vikings couldn't maintain normal circadian rhythms. They developed what historians call segmented sleep, sleeping in multiple shorter periods throughout the day and night, whenever fuel could be spared for heat and whenever their bodies could no longer function from exhaustion. This disrupted sleep schedule had devastating effects on their physical and mental health. Modern sleep research shows us that irregular sleep patterns can cause everything from weakened immune systems to severe depression. For Vikings, who were already dealing with malnutrition and extreme stress, these sleep disruptions compounded their health problems exponentially. Many historical accounts describe Vikings becoming increasingly irrational and violent as winter progressed, likely due in part to chronic sleep deprivation. The work required just to stay alive during winter was backbreaking and never-ending. Vikings had to constantly maintain their fires, which meant someone had to be awake and tending the flames every few hours throughout the night. They had to regularly clear snow from their roofs to prevent collapse, venture outside in deadly conditions to gather whatever fuel they could find, and constantly repair their shelters as the extreme weather damaged them. But perhaps the most exhausting task was the constant battle against moisture and mold. The combination of cooking, breathing, and melting snow for water created massive humidity inside the longhouses. This moisture would freeze on the walls and ceiling, creating ice that would melt during the day and refreeze at night. The constant cycle of freezing and thawing created structural damage that had to be repaired constantly, and the humidity created perfect conditions for mold and fungal growth that could contaminate their food supplies. The tools and weapons that Vikings depended on became nearly useless in extreme cold. Metal tools would become brittle and break at the worst possible moments. Wooden handles would crack and split. Leather would freeze solid and become impossible to work with. Vikings had to constantly maintain and repair their essential tools, but the materials they needed for repairs were often unavailable during winter. A broken axe or knife could mean the difference between life and death. But fixing it might require resources they couldn't spare. The animals that Vikings depended on for food, labor, and materials suffered just as much as the humans. Livestock had to be brought inside during the worst weather, which meant sharing the already cramped living space with cattle, pigs, and chickens. These animals produced waste that had to be managed, consumed precious food resources, and added to the humidity and air quality problems inside the longhouses. But losing livestock was often worse than the inconvenience of housing them. A cow or pig represented not just food, but also milk, leather, bone tools, and other essential materials that couldn't be replaced until spring. Vikings would go to extraordinary lengths to keep their animals alive, sometimes even sharing their own food with livestock when feed ran low. The death of a key animal could trigger a cascade of problems that would doom the entire community. The most terrifying aspect of Viking winter survival was the complete lack of backup plans. In our modern world, we have emergency services, hospitals, supply chains, and communication networks that can help us when things go wrong. Vikings had none of these safety nets. When their primary survival strategy failed, there was no plan B. Communities that found themselves in crisis during winter had to improvise solutions using whatever materials they had on hand, and these desperate measures often led to their doom. Archaeological evidence shows us settlements where Vikings attempted increasingly desperate survival strategies as their situations became hopeless. We find evidence of people burning furniture, tools, and even structural elements of their houses for fuel. We see signs that they ate leather, bones, and anything else that might provide nutrition. Some sites show evidence that communities resorted to cannibalism when all other food sources were exhausted. These archaeological discoveries reveal the final, most horrifying truth about Viking winters. They weren't just cold and difficult. They were elimination events that regularly wiped out entire communities. The Vikings we know from history and legend were the survivors, the ones who made it through these impossible conditions. For every successful Viking settlement, there were probably dozens that simply vanished during particularly harsh winters, leaving behind only scattered artifacts and bones to tell their story. The psychological adaptation required to survive these conditions fundamentally changed how Vikings viewed life and death. They developed a fatalistic worldview that accepted death as a constant companion, not something that happened to other people or in old age, but something that could come for anyone at any moment. This acceptance of mortality influenced everything from their religious beliefs to their approach to warfare and exploration. But this fatalism also gave them a kind of fearlessness that modern people struggle to understand. When you've survived multiple winters where death was a daily possibility, facing enemy warriors in battle probably seemed almost mundane by comparison. The legendary Viking courage that we read about in sagas wasn't just cultural bravado. It was the practical result of living through experiences that would break most modern people psychologically. The children who survived Viking winters grew up with a completely different relationship to risk, hardship, and survival than anything we can imagine today. They learned from infancy that comfort and safety were temporary luxuries, that survival required constant vigilance and preparation, and that the difference between life and death often came down to split-second decisions and perfect execution of survival skills. These children became the adults who would eventually launch the Viking Age, exploring and conquering territories from Greenland to Constantinople. Their willingness to sail into unknown waters, establish settlements in hostile environments, and take enormous risks in pursuit of resources and opportunities wasn't just cultural ambition. It was the practical result of growing up in conditions where taking calculated risks was the only way to survive. The ripple effects of Viking winter survival extended far beyond individual communities. The constant threat of winter starvation drove Vikings to develop increasingly sophisticated raiding and trading networks. They couldn't afford to be self-sufficient, because self-sufficiency in such a harsh environment was impossible. They needed to acquire resources from other regions, which meant they had to become some of the most skilled navigators, traders, and warriors in the medieval world. This creates a fascinating paradox. The very conditions that made Viking settlements barely habitable also forced Vikings to become some of the most adventurous and capable people in human history. Their winter survival skills translated directly into the abilities that allowed them to establish settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and even briefly in North America. The same resourcefulness that kept them alive through brutal winters also enabled them to adapt to completely new environments thousands of miles from home. The navigation skills that Vikings developed partly out of winter necessity became legendary. But what most people don't realize is that these skills were literally forged in the crucible of life or death decision-making. When your community's survival depends on knowing exactly when the last trading voyage of the season needs to depart before the fjords freeze over, you don't get second chances. Viking navigators had to read weather patterns, ocean currents, and seasonal changes with an accuracy that would impress modern meteorologists, because a mistake in timing could mean being trapped away from home when winter arrived. Or worse, being caught at sea when the storms hit. The seasonal trading expeditions that Vikings are famous for weren't just economic opportunities, they were desperate survival missions. Communities would send out their best warriors and traders on voyages that lasted months, knowing that these men might not return, but also knowing that without the resources they brought back, everyone would die during the winter. These weren't casual trading trips where you could come back empty-handed and try again next year. The pressure to succeed was absolute, which explains why Vikings were willing to travel such enormous distances and take such incredible risks to acquire the goods they needed. But here's something that will completely change how you think about Viking exploration. Many of their most famous voyages to Iceland, Greenland, and North America weren't driven by wanderlust or adventure. They were essentially desperate attempts to escape the impossible survival conditions of Scandinavian winters. When your homeland regularly produces winters that kill significant portions of the population, suddenly sailing into unknown waters to establish new settlements doesn't seem nearly as crazy. It was a calculated risk where the potential rewards outweighed the certainty of eventual death if they stayed put. The settlement of Iceland around 870 CE is a perfect example of this winter-driven expansion. The people who made this journey weren't seeking adventure. They were fleeing a homeland where population growth had made winter survival increasingly difficult. Iceland offered the promise of new agricultural land, untapped resources, and most importantly, the possibility of establishing communities that weren't already operating at the razor's edge of survival capacity. But what they found in Iceland was winters that were even more brutal than what they had left behind in Norway. The early Icelandic settlers faced winter conditions that make even the Scandinavian winters we've been discussing look manageable. Iceland's volcanic activity created unpredictable weather patterns with sudden temperature drops that could kill unprepared travelers in hours. The island's position in the North Atlantic meant that storms could arrive with little warning, bringing winds that could literally freeze exposed flesh in minutes. The settlers had to develop entirely new survival strategies, and many of the early settlements simply vanished, their inhabitants presumably dying during particularly harsh winters. What makes the Icelandic expansion even more remarkable is that these settlers were essentially conducting a massive survival experiment with no backup plan. They couldn't just return to Norway if things went wrong because they had burned their bridges, selling everything they owned to fund the journey. They had to make Iceland work or die trying. And the archaeological evidence shows us that many of them did exactly that. Failed settlements dot the Icelandic landscape, silent testimony to communities that couldn't adapt quickly enough to survive their first few winters. The successful Icelandic settlements developed winter survival strategies that were even more extreme than anything we've discussed so far. They learned to use Iceland's geothermal features for heating, essentially building their communities around natural hot springs that could provide warmth even in the depths of winter. But this created a new set of problems, because these geothermal areas were limited and often located in places that were otherwise unsuitable for settlement. Vikings had to choose between access to natural heating and access to good farmland, fresh water, or defensive positions. The Icelandic Vikings also developed new methods of food preservation that took advantage of Iceland's unique climate. They learned to use the constant wind and cold to create natural refrigeration systems that could preserve food for longer periods than traditional smoking or salting methods. But these techniques required perfect timing and precise environmental conditions. A change in wind patterns or an unexpected warm spell could destroy months of carefully preserved food, leaving entire communities facing starvation. The psychological pressure of living in these experimental settlements was enormous. Every decision about resource allocation, every choice about where to build or what to plant, every judgment about when to slaughter livestock or when to preserve food could determine whether the community survived its next winter. The margin for error was even smaller than it had been in Scandinavia, because they didn't have generations of accumulated knowledge about local conditions to guide them. This constant pressure created a culture of innovation that was unlike anything else in the medieval world. Icelandic Vikings couldn't rely on traditional methods because they were operating in an environment where traditional methods often didn't work. They had to constantly experiment, adapt, and improvise, developing new techniques for everything from house construction to food storage to animal husbandry. The successful innovations spread rapidly through the small Icelandic population, while the failures were quickly abandoned, often along with the communities that had tried them. The social structures that emerged in these experimental settlements were also unique. The traditional Viking hierarchy based on military prowess and wealth became less important than practical survival skills. A person who could predict weather patterns, manage food stores efficiently, or develop new building techniques might gain more respect and influence than a traditional warrior. This created a more fluid social structure, where innovation and practical intelligence were highly valued. But this constant innovation came at a terrible cost. The communities that succeeded in Iceland were the ones that could adapt quickly enough to survive their mistakes. The ones that couldn't adapt fast enough simply disappeared, taking their knowledge and innovations with them. This created a brutal evolutionary pressure, where only the most adaptable and resourceful communities survived. But it also meant that much of the knowledge gained through experimentation was lost when communities failed. The religious and cultural implications of these extreme survival conditions were profound. Vikings had always believed in a cosmos where conflict and struggle were fundamental aspects of existence. But the experience of settling new territories in even harsher conditions reinforced these beliefs in ways that shaped their entire worldview. The concept of